Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we have a really interesting show planned. We have Phil Borges, who's the director of CrazyWise, and we're going to be talking to him, kind of getting a sneak preview of his upcoming documentary. So welcome, Phil.
Oh, good to be here, CJ.
So I'm so excited to find out how your project is progressing. So for a little bit, for people who don't know, aren't familiar with Phil, he has spent over 20 years working with indigenous tribes, and has worked at the National Geographic Project, in which he did profiles of 45 different shamans in South America, Africa, Indonesia, and the Arctic Circle. And he's going to be taking the wisdom that he learned throughout doing that work and applying it to mental illness and looking at what we can learn from indigenous cultures about mental illness and potentially better treatment plans. So, welcome again.
Well, thank you.
So, so how's it going? How's the project going?
Well, we're in the very beginning of the edit, actually. We have a little bit of shooting to do, a little more production to do, because two of our subjects, their stories are still unfolding before our
Wow.
eyes. Whenever you do a documentary, they say it's like chasing a wild horse, and
Yeah.
you don't know where it's going to go. But we've got two subjects that just have amazing stories, and I just happened to have gotten off the phone to one of them who's now living in Los Angeles, just moved from New York, and a very incredible ending to her story, or at least at this point, it's at a very
Yeah.
incredible.
So tell us, can you share, or is that we have to watch a movie to find out about her journey?
Well, I guess I could summarize it. She is an African American woman, 32 years old. Her name is Akaya. And just briefly, she was traumatized in childhood. She was molested by her father from the time she was about 5 years old. And got married, and this is just a very brief sketch. Got married and had three children. Her husband started cheating on her when she was pregnant with her last child, and
Mm,
she went into another severe depression, or she went into a depression at that time and was hospitalized, ended up getting divorced and had
no.
severe depressions. And the husband took the children, and she went through just downward spiral into very deep depressions and suicide attempts, and then came across a peer-to-peer respite center. She's a
Mhm.
very good poet and musician, and that brought started bringing her out of her depression,
Mhm.
and she was recovered so well they hired her to be a counselor for other people going through their first mental emotional breaks.
Mhm.
And then she happened to meet a Sangoma in her lineage. And a Sangoma is the South African shaman, if you
Mhm.
will, South African healer. And she went through this initiation that she just graduated from about a month ago.
Mm.
And now she has reunited with her kids. She's moved in with her husband, ex-husband, I should say. He's now remarried.
Mhm.
She's moved from New York to San Diego, where they live, and
Mhm.
moved in with him. And her ex-wife, she's living downstairs in a basement apartment they have. And so the whole family,
Wow. Wow.
the husband and the new wife, are all together and
Wow.
being just fine. And it's been just a remarkable um, change for this woman, from the depth
Mhm.
of depression and despair and suicide to now having her kids back, being a counselor, a very successful counselor. She's on the speaking circuit telling her story. So, anyway, I just got off
Wow.
the phone with her, hearing how she's doing in San Diego.
Wow. It must be such a privilege to be able to share a person's story from such a challenging time when she was actually, basically suicidal, having all these to the point now where her family was reunited. What's that like being able to share those stories with people?
It's just, I just feel honored that people are willing to share, and our other subject, Adam, who's still having issues, but he wants his story out there. So, with the hope that it's going to help somebody else.
Mm,
But yeah, just to get in and hear these intimate stories it's an honor.
yeah.
And yeah, it's also fascinating to me to hear what people go through and how they can go through these recoveries.
Tell us Adam's story for people who, give us a little preview snapshot of Adam's story.
Oh, yeah. Adam really started me on this whole journey into this investigation of mental health in our country and around the world, really. And um, he had a break when he was 20 years old, a psychotic break, a cognitive dysfunction in very technical terms. And it really debilitated him, so he couldn't work, he couldn't see his friends. And this was a kid that was one of the most popular kids in his high school,
Mm,
extremely gifted physically, was a karate black belt at 5 years old, rode a two-wheel bicycle at the age of two,
wow.
um, and musically inclined, very talented. And all of a sudden, that was all taken away in this break. And he spent 4 years on medications. And evidently, he was given just about every medication for bipolar that exists. He said he was on 15 pills a day for a while, having severe side effects. And he went cold turkey after 4 years and took a Vipassana meditation retreat, which worked for him. 10 days of straight silent meditation, 10 hours a day, and he came out a changed individual,
Mm,
in terms of the peace of mind, as Dad said, his use of substance. He was self medicating too, as at the time. Anyway, that really shifted. So he
yeah.
started going to these meditation retreats, and it kept him stable. He got a job.
Wow.
And so this is a longer story.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have time, but as he got into these meditation retreats, he was going deeper and deeper, and things from his childhood were coming up,
Hmm.
issues coming to the surface. The retreat, and it got harder for him, and the retreat center on his fourth meditation retreat, when he was having a bit of a hard time, found out about his past mental history and said, "We cannot take the liability for you here," and had to send him home. And he was kind of cut off from this thing that was working for him.
Mm,
And another revelation came up about his family that alienated him from his family. And then,
mm,
the worst thing can happen to a person in that situation, he got isolated.
mm.
Family and from the meditation community that he was using to stabilize himself. And I met him about 3 months before he went into that isolation stage, and I've watched him just spiral down from that. And he has after I can't get into all the details because it would take up your whole program.
Right, right.
But anyway, he's coming out of it, but he's still not out of it. He's still self-medicating
Yeah,
with alcohol and marijuana. But
yeah, yeah. Wow. So there are two contrasting stories. One in which someone had a community of poets and other artists that kind of brought her out of her depression, and another one who is now being ostracized and alone and isolated. Um, what is your takeaway when you think about telling the story of these two and the role of community in helping people with mental illness?
Very good question, CJ. Yes, they to complicate it a little bit, Adam did find a community outside of his family and his friends that he had before. The difference between the two communities is where the story lies.
Mm,
And in Akaya's case, it was a peer respite center, very professional. The peers in New York, and peers, by the way, are people with lived experience,
hmm.
people that have had a severe mental, emotional crisis and have worked through it. They're not on their meds anymore. They're fully functioning. They are working in these centers to help others. They're wounded healers, so to
Hmm.
speak.
Hmm.
And so they all have that in common. Um, in Adam's case, he found a community of poets, artists, and a lot of other homeless people around this bookstore in Redmond here
Hmm.
called Soul Food Books. And he started meeting with the how should I say it, the young people who met in back of this store, and they were associated with the bookstore, and they all had these talents of being musicians and poets and so on and so forth, but they were all self-medicating pretty heavily.
Mm-hmm.
And so they weren't out of the mix in terms of they weren't um, completely recovered, I guess you would
Right,
say.
right.
And it started getting worse in terms of the not only the stuff they were using, but in the violence that started to spring up. They would, if somebody said the wrong thing, somebody would attack another person,
Mm-hmm.
and actually a murder out there.
Ooh,
So in that
wow.
community, even though he had a community of people, it wasn't an extremely healthy community.
Mm-hmm. Someone was asked, the listener is asking, where did this take place and was this real? And this is real. This is a real person, and this took
Oh
place
yeah,
in Redmond, Washington.
right.
Yeah, it's almost hard to believe. It almost sounds like these are just stories of a movie that you're going to be made, but these are real. It's a documentary with real people that, and you're following their lives. Um, so now let's actually map this to shamanism. So you had met Adam, and um, when you met with Adam, what made you connect this with shamanism, which is something the indigenous people that you had studied before? What was the connection that you saw?
Well, yeah, it all started for me when I was invited. I was doing a project in Tibet on the Tibetan story, and I
Mm-hmm.
was actually in the little town in India where the Dalai Lama lives, and I started the story there,
Mm-hmm.
and I was invited while I was there to go in and watch a young monk that is known as the Kutan, is the physical person who can take on the essence of the protector spirit of Tibet, known as
Wow.
the Nechung Oracle.
Okay.
So in our words, we would say he's channeling the Nechung Oracle.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I was invited to go into this little monastery and watch him go into trance and channel this oracle, and it was just a spectacular scene that I'd never seen before, where
Yeah.
the monks were chanting, and he goes into this trance, and he starts speaking in a different voice, and then he, after a few minutes, kind of collapses, and they have to help him out of the room, almost carry him out of the room.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, what a um, a ceremonial performance? Is this real or what?
Right.
And a couple of days later, I got to go and interview him,
Mm-hmm.
and when I asked him how he was chosen to be the Kutan, he went into this long story of going through these personality changes that all of a sudden descended upon him. He was very gregarious and he turned into sort of a withdrawn, very quiet person. He started having these anxiety attacks. He described electric like currents jolting through his body, and he thought he was very ill, but the monks in his monastery around him framed it as if he had this special sensitivity, talent, if you will, to be able to access levels of consciousness very different than our everyday normal um, state of consciousness.
Right.
And so he was eventually mentored by some of the monks who um, knew more about this, and that's how he became the Kutan that
Wow.
channels in Oracle of Tibet. So I thought that was interesting,
Yeah.
and it was a couple of years later that I met another woman in a tribe up in northern Kenya. I was doing all this human rights
Wait, can
work.
I ask you a question before you go into that? Because I'm curious about when he actually went from, being a friendly, happy person to kind of quiet and withdrawn. Is it something that he just all of a sudden was going through these different states, or how did he describe how those different states were moving through him, or did he? I don't know.
Yeah, he said it took place over about a 2 year period.
Hmm.
And I mean, he described, and we've since done an interview with him 20 years. This was 20 years ago that I
Yeah.
just met and watched that. So I just met him again in LA about, well, last January,
Hmm.
actually. And he described in detail for us because we wanted it
Yeah.
in detail for the film. And during that time, he had one severe nosebleed that almost killed him. He couldn't
Wow.
stop the nosebleed. So there was a lot of different things going on, but he was also having these very intense dreams. But all this happened over about a 2 year period,
Wow.
and they actually took him to interview with the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama said, "Well, first of all, do if you indeed are the next Kutan for the Nechung Oracle, the main Oracle of Tibet, do you want to go there?
Wow.
Because
Hmm.
you can't
Right.
be a very hard life, and the Kutans are known to die early."
Mm.
Um, and he said, "Yes, I want to dedicate my life to this."
Hmm.
And he started that initiation and training that they go through.
I was just talking to Sandra Ingerman, who is very into shamanism. We were talking about shamanism, and she said what happens is whether it's a physical illness like the nosebleed or the tremors or personality, like a mental illness in which you're shifting different states of being, she viewed these challenging physical states as initiations into, and she said an initiation was a challenging physical or mental state that helped you thin out your ego so that you could actually get to the essence of your being versus this egoic self. He thought he was this guy before, and and he was, and all of a sudden he was not that guy. He was this guy, that guy, and the guy with bloody nose, a guy that's trembling. But all of those things were as initiation, almost as a test to draw that person into their destiny, which was to be a shaman. Does that register as similar to the experience with your conversation with the Kutan?
Yes, and with my conversations with many of these people we call shaman
Uh huh.
since that time.
Yeah.
Um, so, yes, definitely. Traditional cultures look at these symptoms that we put under the category of mental illness and give many, many different names to: bipolar, schizophrenia,
Hmm.
severe depression, whatever it is. They look at those symptoms as an almost as an opportunity for the individual to look deeper into themselves.
Right.
And I, from what I've gathered, is they think of these individuals as extremely sensitive, more
Hmm.
sensitive than the average person.
Hmm.
That's why they're having such a reaction to a life circumstance, a past trauma, um, whatever. Sometimes to uh, a substance they've
Hmm.
taken, as happens in the Amazon. But they do have this extra sensitivity, and so they look at these symptoms as a calling.
Hmm.
And many times, many of the people I talked to resisted the calling because becoming a healer or a seer for the community, again, what we call shaman, they go by different names in the different groups you go into, but that's just an extra amount of work
Right.
you have
Yeah.
to take on. I mean, if you're a goat herder, which one I met in Pakistan was, you still have to herd your goats, but you also have the responsibility of taking care of the
Right.
health of the people.
Right. Being a shaman, it's not like being a medical doctor in which that is your job now. That's an additional responsibility in addition to whatever work or revenue things that you were doing beforehand. So, like if you're a goat herder, you're still a goat herder. And now you're also healing people by going into these altered states, which I assume, like you said, is extremely physically taxing to do.
Yes. Um, and in fact, most of them don't get paid. In
Yeah.
fact, one woman I was with in Mongolia, and watched her see people over a 3 day period, and we paid her to stay near her little house, her little tent. She lived in a gur,
Hmm.
and she gave all that money away to the patients over that 3 day
Mm,
period. So not only wasn't she getting paid, she gave it, but and so yeah, so but they're told if they resist the calling that they could become very sick and possibly even die.
yeah.
Almost like they have to go there.
And what's so interesting is contrasting the approach, which is this is a calling for you to go inside and use your sensitivity to explore an inner calling or maybe an external calling. There's a calling asking you to go for direct revelation and understand something. Whereas in the Western approach is you better take those medicines to stop the calling. Like hang up the phone, take the medicine, and medicate yourself because you don't want to hear any of those things. I mean, because and I know as the director of CrazyWise that you've been talking to neuroscientists, people in meditation, shamans, neuro psychologists. I mean, when you look at the different approaches between kind of the Western approach and this indigenous culture and kind of an Eastern approach, what would you say is the difference?
Well, for one, symptoms are looked at as something to indicate that something needs to be looked at deeper. Or
Right.
the symptoms in a traditional culture are they're not classified as a disease of the brain, for instance, like
Mm-hmm.
we tend to do. They are looked upon as an indication that you have to look at other things in your life. Call it ego, the way you look at the world, the way you hold the world, um, the psychological, your social aspects, and your spiritual aspects, and reconsider those, because once you start the initiation, it's typically a death of the old self and a rebirth of a new self.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, that new self has a much wider view of what that self is. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't just this thing in this bag of skin, but it includes much more.
Right.
The community, the inhabitants of the earth, the cosmos, even. I
Right.
mean, it's a big expansion on what you consider self to be,
Ah.
and and that process is, yeah, it's a very difficult process. I mean, Akaya, or one of the people in our film, just went through it, and she talks about how difficult it was. And in our language, in her case, we used her because it's stuff we can relate to. In her case, she had to re-experience all the emotions and issues and trauma that she had when she was 5 years old, and
Mm-hmm.
go through those and face her fears and face all the mistrust she had around other people and adults that came out of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about it very much in detail, how instead of trying to suppress those feelings and emotions, to actually experience them,
What you go into them.
where you go into them and learn about yourself through them.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it the big difference is how we look at the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
One, they're part of a disease that we have to get rid of, and the other, the symptoms are something you need to listen to and to integrate whatever it is into your psyche in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I went to look up mental illness on the American Psychiatric Association. And first of all, there's two full pages of different types of, there's eating disorders, there's emotional disorders, there's anxiety. I mean, there's just literally, they have all these different categories of things. And I thought, well, I wonder, and I was going to ask you, do you think, whether someone has bulimia or they actually they're pyromaniac and they have impulse control or they have panic attacks, whatever, literally 2 pages worth of disorders on the APA. Do you think that all of those can be attributed to sensitivity and initiation of calling? Or do you think that some of them are like, those are real mental, neuroscience things that need the brain to be recalibrated? Or do you see all of those things as being calls to initiation?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. Um, because I'm not an expert in
Yeah,
this. You
yeah.
know, the things I know, since I started this just 3 years ago, is number one, we've got a major crisis in this country. And in terms of, and I didn't realize how severe it was, but in terms of the number of people right now in our prisons that have a mental illness, 56%.
Wow.
Yes, I had no idea.
Me neither.
But the estimate of the homeless that have that is around 25 to 30%. And the number of people going on SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, due to mental disorders is 1,100 people a day, and it has quadrupled in the last 20 years. And in that same period of time, the amount of medications we're using has increased 80-fold, or at least the amount we're spending on it has
Right.
increased 80-fold.
Wow.
So if that's our main treatment, and we're having these results of the people going on disability increasing so rapidly, and people that aren't even being able to get on SSDI and ending up in prison or on our streets, um, we've really got a crisis on our hands.
Yeah.
And of all those disorders you were talking about, they're all listed in this book called the DSM, the
Hmm.
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
And that has, I didn't know much about that either, but it was first written in 1952, and the fifth edition just came out a couple of months ago.
Right.
And the number of disorders listed had increased 300%.
Wow.
And so the big blowback coming from the psychiatrists in Europe now And even some of our own psychiatrists are saying, hey, wait a minute, we're starting to pathologize normal human experience.
Mm.
Who have a person who loses their spouse after 40 or 50 years of marriage and they go into grieving, and in DSM-5 it's indicating that if that grieving goes longer than 2 weeks, we put it over into the category of major depression, which there's a medication for.
Wow.
And somebody told me sibling rivalry disorders in there
Oh
somewhere.
my God.
So
Oh my God. Wow.
they are all these
Well, but there
different.
are different, it's almost like marketing tools for the pharmaceuticals to get you to buy more drugs. Like if you have like, because we need to have an excuse for taking the drugs, but if we know we're in a manual and someone who's a professional in the medical arena says, yes, you have sibling disorder, take a pill, or maybe it will go away if I take this pill. It's awful. Uh, I don't mean to bash the pharmaceuticals because I think for a lot of people they do a lot, but I'm beginning to question a lot more than I did before.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at. Yeah, there's no doubt that medications have their place. And if I could make a general statement about it, what I believe at this time in my in my
Yeah.
involvement in the world of mental health is they're good in the acute stages. They can be very helpful if you've had one of these breaks and all of a sudden you're in this manic state where you can't sleep. If you're deprived of sleep for a week, you're going to go crazy.
Hmm.
Anybody would.
Right.
And you could go off the rails. And so in terms of that, where they're not so good is when you look at these states as disease states that we have no cure for, but we have to manage it for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
And they become chronic because there's severe issues with them. I mean, there's diabetes, severe weight gain. Um, Most of the people that take many of these say they just feel like zombies.
The
There's
side effects, yeah.
all the side effects in terms of your emotions. Yeah, you don't have the extreme negative emotions, but you don't have the positive ones either. It just
Right.
tones everything down, and so there's issues with using them on a chronic
Well, with
level.
someone like I have friends who are taking meds and they have been told you can never go off this med. I mean, you have to be on this med for the rest of your life because if you don't, and so they've tried to wind down, like which I'm sure that the gal Anaya, is that her name, had to go through
I,
a
yeah,
kind of a winding down before because you can't just go cold turkey like and probably a lot of different things you can't go cold turkey, but it's hard because these things a lot of times they become lifetime, extremely lucrative for the pharmaceutical company, but not so much for the person who has to pay for those medicines for the rest of their life. Because having to pay for those expensive meds, they kind of all of a sudden leave you hostage to the job that you don't want to be in just because your meds are going to be covered. It's just, and all the other host of other things, like you just said, the medical, the side effects that, the side effects of those meds that they have on other physical symptoms and your emotional state being dampened. It's so hard to know what to do. And what did the neuroscientists say after, when you were presenting your thesis of like, hey, there's a different treatment plan. What was the reaction of psychologists and neuroscientists when you've talked to them about it?
well, the people we've talked to are very engaged in their corner of the investigation.
Yeah.
And whether you're looking for the correct gene, the correct chemical balance, um, the not only the genes but the neural pathways that could be stimulated now. We have all these incredible scanning techniques.
Right.
Um, that's where you are. You're totally fascinated that
Yeah.
you're learning how these things work, but the issue I have with it is I don't think anybody can name a person that's been helped by knowing which genes are active in schizophrenia, for instance,
Hmm.
or which clusters are present in people with schizophrenia, or which neural pathway. I mean, we're a long way off from that. And although I respect the science and the incredible investigations that are going on, in terms of the billions of dollars being spent, it could be much better spent in social support, psychological support, and spiritual support.
Hmm.
You know, the thing is, the biomedical aspects that we're putting all of our cards into, because we're a technological culture that loves the magic bullet fix.
Hmm.
There's not a magic bullet fix to this. These
Hmm.
are life circumstance issues many times,
Right.
and it takes much more. And so that biomedical push is sort of muscling out these other three very important aspects of mental health.
Right.
That's the issue. And so, um, we interviewed one individual, and E. Fuller Torrey is known when there's a shooting.
Right.
Go to 60 Minutes and they cover it. They bring in the most famous psychiatrist in America, as they call
Hmm.
E. Fuller Torrey.
Hmm.
Nice gentleman. We went back and interviewed him. He is pretty convinced that schizophrenia is caused by a toxoplasmosis organism carried by cats. And
Whoa.
you can trace the rise in schizophrenia in Western civilization to our adopting cats into the household.
Whoa. Okay.
So whether that's, there might be that biological aspect that contributes, but that's where his whole investigation is
Right.
going. And he is hoping to find, if he finds the way to address that organism, that he'll solve schizophrenia. And I think it's a long shot that will happen.
Well, yeah, even if he did, there's still like you said, those three other factors still remain. Like, let's say that you could find a gene that actually, you could actually suppress the genetic expression of schizophrenia by taking a whatever, I don't know, gene manipulation. They had found some way of manipulating the genes. You still have all the psychological trauma from your family, like you talk about Adam, your family maybe not seeing you anymore, being isolated from society, like those still exist even if all those same things are still there. So even if my only point is, even if you did solve it, there's still these other issues, right? So you talked about three different things. I would love in the next 10 minutes before we wrap up, what are the three things then would you say are good things to try? If you are, maybe you're thinking about getting off your meds, trying something different. You mentioned three different: psychological, sociological. What was the other one?
Well, spiritual.
Spiritual. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, those are the things that we've looked into that are being used. We went to Brazil where they use mediums, very spiritual approaches, right in the psychiatric hospitals, and they're getting great results. Um,
Mediums are
uh,
people who talk to the people who have passed on to the other side.
well, they look, the metaphors can. I always like to talk in
Right.
terms of metaphor when we're talking about the spirit world, or because none of us know exactly what that
That's
is.
true. That's a good point.
Every culture has its own metaphors to address different levels of consciousness and different realities. But they use the metaphor of the spirit world, yes, and that there's spirit entities, and they pray to these entities, much like the shaman does, to negotiate with those entities to help the person know more about themselves, or they ask information and bring it back to this world from the spirit world to help the person. Now, none of that is going to be very relevant in our world,
Right.
but the things. So I'll just say, CrazyWise is looking at two things. What do traditional cultures have to teach us? What do people with lived experience have to teach us about what helps?
Hmm.
And so, starting with traditional cultures, number one, it's important in those first stages. If you've got a child away at school and they have one of these breaks, and it often happens to freshmen in college,
Hmm.
and they're taken away in a cop car to the emergency room, strapped in the back room till they can
Mm.
get a psychiatrist to come in. Well, that's the worst thing you can do. Isolation, is one of the worst things you can do. The other thing that people with lived experience say is they want to know that they can recover. So many times they're told they can't recover.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine the framing of that, what you're going through in those terms. You've got a brain disease you can't recover from. You're in that vulnerable state. You can imagine how much that can spin you into paranoia and depression.
Yeah.
The other thing is, they really, the people that help them the most, they say, are peers, people that have gone through it and have recovered, that, they can tell us, I did it and this is how I did it, and they are the best guides. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't somebody that's gone through school and learned how to categorize certain types of disorders. It's somebody who has had that lived experience. So
Mm.
having a peer, not being framed in a negative way, and then having the knowledge that it's important that you experience your feelings and not
Mm-hmm.
try to suppress them,
Mm-hmm.
um, and having a support in that.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you go into these wild states, and I've seen a bit of it with Adam, and talked to other people about their states, it's frightening to everybody around you.
Right.
Family doesn't know what to do. You're a totally different person all of a sudden,
Right.
and it's frightening. And so the thing that traditional cultures have to teach us is, one, they're not as frightened by non-ordinary states of consciousness, and they're not as adverse to running away from negative emotions.
Mm.
It could be that they don't have the tools to run away from them with,
Right.
like we do now.
Right.
They don't have the medications to run
Right.
away
So they have to deal with their negative emotions because they can't take a
from.
pill and make it go away. That's interesting.
And if somebody's having one of these events, or they gather the whole tribe around, if somebody's having an argument even with somebody, they gather that whole tribe around those people, are a good portion of the tribe, and work it out together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more of a socially cohesive thing. And I hope I'm not rambling here, but the things with traditional cultures are, they avoid
Right. No,
isolation.
no isolation. Community is really critical, and getting support for your emotions and how to process it. Getting acceptance, like, and not kind of, and it's a complete contrast to what you see today, right? Like you said, like if you experience a breakdown or someone in your family has mental illness, at least during my family's time, if someone had mental illness, you'd be like, no one tell anyone, this is our family secret. And then and even those movies where you hide someone in the attic because you can't, they cannot be seen, like all those, and no one talks about it, all those things couldn't be worse, is what I'm hearing, than what people who have lived through these experiences say that they need to recover.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the big thing that's changing right now is the internet. These people are getting together. These people with lived experience are getting together and forming organizations like Hearing Voices Network, and talking to one another, and all of a sudden
Mm.
saying, "Hey, you too? Yeah, me too." And and all of a sudden in groups they're coming out of the stigma
Mm.
of hiding the the hiding that the stigma caused. And so that's a big thing that's happening right now. It's caused this whole movement going on. And that's one of the things we're highlighting in the film is this movement of people with lived experience
Mm.
that are saying, hey, this is what worked for me. This is what didn't work.
How would you find these peer networks in your area? So if someone is listening in the program and they want to actually explore some of these things in their own region, what would I type in on the internet?
Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of them, and Sandy, our communications director, take and puts them on our resource page.
Okay.
It's if you go to crazywisefilm.org
Mm-hmm.
and go to our resource page, there's a lot of those organizations that point to the peer groups in different parts of the country.
Right, right. So in some ways, given that our typical medical treatment is not going to offer that, the alternative is to do things like meditation, like Adam did. And it's interesting because I saw the video on the crazywisefilm.com, or is it .com website, and he was saying that it helped him. And then he said it was helping him because he kind of had this understanding about life that he didn't understand, and that it was probably helping him control his mind and being more mindful, and not moving into various kind of story oriented states, which is, I think, part of the emotional, issue that you have. What were your takeaways from the meditation people that you talk to? Is that what's happening in the meditation? Is that it's about controlling your mind as well as going into those states when they arise?
Right. Well, I did it at one of these Vipassana retreats that
Yeah.
Adam had just to see what he had gone through. Um, yeah, what I gathered from it is yes, once you calm that chattering mind, the ego mind, so to speak, that tells us that we are this separate being apart from everything else. Once you quiet that, you start going into these deeper states. And yes, some of these past traumatic experiences can come up. And I think that's as we interviewed some of the people who run these meditation retreat centers, that is one of the weak points in
Mm.
them, is that can come up. And Adam, it started coming up in his fourth retreat, but it could come up on the ninth day of a 10-day retreat, and then the person is sent out into the world
Right.
uh, without any support, and um, peer support, some sort of understanding support is critical when you're in these processing stages
Hmm.
of mental emotional distress.
Yeah, I can see that because sometimes when you have those things come up at the very end, you feel undone, like you feel like you're unraveling, and there's no one else to integrate your new learnings and new self into your new world. So you kind of feel like unglued. I mean, I actually saw when I went to a Vipassana training, a mindfulness meditation retreat, this woman just became unglued at the very last day, and then, she was leaving being in this unglued state. So I can see how having a network where you're going through these traumatic experiences, reliving your childhood and not knowing how to deal with it, and just being mindful of it doesn't make it go away.
That's right.
Yeah.
And yeah, the whole spiritual journey, be it through meditation or people doing ayahuasca now, or I
Yeah.
mean, all sorts of things going on, as you know. It's not an easy journey.
Oh
I
no.
mean, talking about the death of your ego in a way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's it's something that doesn't want to die. It's
Yes.
your sense of self,
Yeah.
and and um, it has to be done in a very methodic and careful way
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
supported way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and these people that have these breaks, yeah, that's an opening, but you need to have some support. That's what it seems like to me at this
Yeah. Yeah.
journey, looking into this whole world.
We've been talking to Phil Borges, the director of CrazyWise. Thank you so much for this work because I think it's really important. Like you said, it's a mental health crisis, but really it's a spiritual crisis. Our society, we're actually having a crisis of spirit, I think, which is why I think you see all those numbers kind of ticking up when you started looking at the research. So it's really important, I think, to understand both solutions that work. Just medicating everyone and silencing them is not not the solution.
No, it really
And it's
isn't.
not the most economical solution either. I mean, think about what we're spending as a society on things that don't even work, you know?
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you so much for being here. Folks, check out crazywisefilm.com. It will be coming out later in the year. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.